Welcome back to our final deep dive into development.
Glad to be here.
So last time we really got into industrialization and all the amazing things that came out of it, but also, all the problems that it kind of created.
Right. Problems that are still with us today.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, the very things that made it so successful, the drive for efficiency and progress, those kind of ended up backfiring and leading to like the environmental issues and the social disruptions that we're dealing with now.
It's almost like we need to rethink the whole idea of progress.
Yeah, and I think that's where James C. Scott comes in.
Okay, I've heard of him.
Yeah. So he wrote this really influential book called Seeing Like a State.
Okay.
And it's all about how what he calls high modernism.
High modernism.
Yeah, it's basically this idea that, the state can come in and kind of like plan and control every aspect of society.
Okay.
And, on the surface, that might sound good.
Yeah.
Like, who wouldn't want a more efficient and rational world?
But Scott argues that these high modernist schemes often have these unintended negative consequences.
Okay, how so?
Well, for one thing, they often ignore local knowledge.
Okay.
Like the wisdom that people have built up over generations about, how to manage resources or, how to organize their communities.
Yeah.
And they also tend to try and simplify complex systems.
Right.
Which, never really works out the way you think it will.
So you're saying that sometimes trying to make things better can actually make them worse.
Exactly. And Scott gives some really compelling examples of this in his book.
Like what?
Well, one that really stuck with me was the forced villagization schemes in Tanzania.
Okay.
Where the government basically tried to move people from their scattered settlements into these planned villages.
And I'm guessing that didn't go so well.
It was a total disaster.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it completely disrupted traditional agricultural practices, and it also destroyed a lot of the social fabric of these communities.
So it's like they were trying to impose this prefabricated solution onto a dynamic system.
That's a great way to put it.
And it just didn't fit.
No, it didn't.
It's like trying to cram a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's Tanzania. What are some other examples that Scott talks about?
Well, another one that's really interesting is Le Corbusier's vision of urban planning.
Oh, yeah, with those towering buildings and super wide streets.
That's the one.
And it always looks so pristine and organized in those architectural drawings.
Right.
I heard that in reality, it doesn't work out so well.
No, not really. I mean, it creates these really sterile and impersonal environments, and it doesn't really take into account how people actually want to live and interact with each other.
So it's like another example of high modernism gone wrong.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got forced villagization in Tanzania, and we've got Le Corbusier's urban planning. What else does Scott talk about?
Another one that I think is really relevant is scientific forestry.
Scientific forest?
Yeah, so the basic idea was to maximize timber yields by planting these really uniform forests with just one type of tree.
Okay, and what was wrong with that?
Well, it turns out that these monoculture forests are actually really vulnerable to disease and pests because there's no diversity. If one tree gets sick, they all get sick.
Oh, wow. So it's like the opposite of how a natural forest works.
Exactly. In a natural forest, you have all this biodiversity, which makes it much more resilient.
Okay, so it seems like what Scott's saying is that we need to be more humble in our approach to development.
Absolutely.
We need to recognize that we don't have all the answers and that we need to respect the wisdom that already exists in communities.
Exactly. We need to be more like gardeners and less like engineers.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, we need to nurture and cultivate rather than try to control and dominate.
Okay, so this is all really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about the economics of common goods, which is something we've talked about before. And, the classic example is the tragedy of the commons.
Right, where everyone's acting in their own self-interest and they end up depleting the shared resource.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you've also mentioned examples where communities have successfully managed common goods.
I have, and those examples really challenge that whole tragedy narrative.
Okay, so what are some examples of that?
Well, one that comes to mind is the way that West African farmers manage their land.
Okay.
They have these really intricate systems of mixed cropping and resource management that are based on generations of accumulated wisdom.
Oh, and those systems have been working for a long time.
They have, which shows that we don't always have to succumb to that selfish every man for himself mentality.
Right. It's like they've figured out how to cooperate.
Exactly. And it's not just about good intentions either.
Yeah.
They have these really clear rules and norms. And they also have mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement.
So it's like a self-regulating system.
In a way, yeah.
Right.
And a key ingredient is trust. Yeah, people have to trust that their neighbors are going to follow the rules. And they have to trust that the system is fair.
So it's not just about the rules, it's about the relationships between people.
Exactly. And I think that's something that's often missing from top-down development schemes.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
They tend to focus on like the technical aspects of things, but they forget about the human element.
Right, and without that human element, it's hard to create something that's truly sustainable.
I think that's a really important point.
So, listener, what do you think?
Yeah, have you seen any examples of successful common good management in your own life?
Or maybe some examples of what it hasn't worked out so well.
It'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts.
Okay, so we've talked about Scott's critique of high modernism.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the economics of common goods. But there's another big question that I think we need to address.
What's that?
Fairness.
Fairness.
Yeah, like how do we make sure that development is actually fair?
That's a huge question.
It is. And it's one that I think we need to grapple with.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not enough to just create economic growth.
Right.
We need to make sure that the benefits of that growth are shared widely.
And that everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Exactly. And that's where things get really complicated.
Okay, so how do we even begin to think about fairness in development?
Well, I think one place to start is by looking at who's actually driving development.
Right.
Like who's making the decisions and who's benefiting from them.
So are you saying that sometimes development projects can actually exacerbate inequality?
I think that's definitely a risk.
Okay, so how do we avoid that?
Well, I think we need to be really careful about whose voices are being heard and whose interests are being served.
And I think this is where the concept of non-state social welfare comes in.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, it's the idea that organizations like NGOs and religious groups are increasingly involved in providing social services.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
And it's a really interesting trend because it means that there are all these new actors involved in development.
Right, and it's not just happening in developing countries either.
No, it's a global phenomenon.
So what are the implications of this for fairness?
Well, on the one hand, these non-state actors can reach people who might be overlooked by government programs. But on the other hand, if they're not accountable or if they have their own biases, they could actually make inequality worse.
Right. It's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important to have these conversations about fairness.
I agree. We need to be thinking critically about who's benefiting from development.
And who's being left behind.
Absolutely. It's really about understanding, the power dynamics at play.
Okay, so it's not just about good intentions.
No, definitely not. I mean, you can have the best intentions in the world and still end up reinforcing existing inequalities.
And I think that's where the work of Melani Cammett and Lauren M. MacLean is so important.
Oh, yeah. They've done some fascinating research on this.
Their work really gets into the nitty-gritty of how non-state actors can both help and hinder development.
It's a really complex issue.
It is, because on the one hand, these groups can be incredibly effective at reaching marginalized communities. Like they can provide essential services that the government might not be able to.
Right. But the question is, are they actually doing that?
And are they doing it in a way that's fair and equitable?
Exactly. And that's not always easy to determine.
No, it's not. And that's why accountability is so crucial.
Absolutely. Because if these groups aren't accountable to the people they're supposed to be serving, then they can end up doing more harm than good.
And they give a really interesting example of this in their work, don't they?
They do. It's about the introduction of private school vouchers in Chile.
Okay, I've heard a little bit about that. What happened?
So basically, the Chilean government decided to give parents vouchers that they could use to send their kids to private schools.
Okay.
And the idea was to give parents more choice and to improve the quality of education overall.
Sounds good in theory.
It did, but in practice, it had some unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it led to a huge increase in the number of private schools.
Okay.
And a lot of these schools were really expensive.
So I'm guessing that not everyone could afford to send their kids to these schools.
Exactly. The vouchers only covered a portion of the cost. So families who couldn't afford to make up the difference were basically left behind.
And that created a whole new set of inequalities.
It did. And it also raised questions about the role of the state in education.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, is the government still responsible for providing quality education for all citizens?
Or is it okay to just hand that responsibility over to the private sector?
And that's a debate that's happening all over the world right now.
It is, and there are no easy answers.
No. Because it's not just about education either.
Right.
It's about healthcare. It's about housing. It's about all the essential services that people need to thrive.
Exactly. And I think the Chilean voucher program really highlights the complexities of trying to achieve fairness in development.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we need to be really thoughtful about how we design and implement policies.
Absolutely, because even the best intentions can sometimes lead to unintended consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of fairness.
Yeah.
And we've seen how things can go wrong even when we're trying to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important to remember that development isn't just about fixing problems.
Right.
It's also about creating something new.
It's about building a better future.
Exactly. And that requires us to be creative and innovative.
Absolutely. We need to be willing to challenge the status quo.
And to come up with new solutions to old problems.
And to new problems, too.
Right, because the world is changing so rapidly.
It is, and the challenges we face today are different from the challenges we faced even a decade ago.
Okay, so given all that, how do we even begin to think about the future of development?
Well, I think one thing that's becoming increasingly clear is that we need to move beyond this idea that there's one right way to do development.
So no more one-size-fits-all solutions.
Exactly, because what works in one context might not work in another.
And I think this is where the concept of context specificity comes up.
Oh, yeah, that's a really important idea.
It is, because it means that we need to pay attention to the unique circumstances of each place.
And the unique needs of each community.
Right, and that's not always easy to do.
No, it's not, but it's essential.
Okay, so we need to be context-specific. What else do we need to be thinking about?
Well, I think another really important thing is to be more people-centered.
People-centered?
Yeah, so instead of focusing on things like economic growth, we need to focus on people's well-being.
So things like health and education and happiness.
Exactly, because ultimately development is about people.
It is. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Absolutely. And that's a vision that I think we can all get behind.
And I think it's also a vision that's more likely to be sustainable in the long run.
I agree, because when people are happy and healthy, they're more likely to take care of their environment.
And they're more likely to be productive members of society.
Exactly. It's a win-win for everyone.
Okay, so we need to be context-specific, and we need to be people-centered. What else?
Well, I think another key ingredient is innovation.
Innovation.
Yeah, we need to be constantly coming up with new ways to solve problems.
And that includes both technical innovations and social innovations.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that makes development so exciting.
It is, because it's a field that's constantly evolving.
And it's a field where we can really make a difference in people's lives.
Okay, so we've got context specificity, we've got people-centeredness, and we've got innovation.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, I think the last piece of the puzzle is collaboration.
Collaboration.
Yeah, we need to be working together.
And across sectors and across borders.
Exactly, because the challenges we face today are too big for any one person or organization to solve on their own.
Right. It's going to take all of us working together.
To create a better future.
And speaking of the future, I think it's time to talk about one of the biggest forces shaping the world today.
What's that?
Technology.
Oh, yeah. Technology is changing everything.
It is, and it's having a huge impact on development.
It is. I mean, in some ways it's making development easier, but in other ways it's making it more challenging.
Okay, so how is technology making development easier?
Well, for one thing, it's giving people access to information and resources that they never had before.
Right, love the internet.
Exactly. The internet is connecting people all over the world. And it's giving them access to education, healthcare, financial services, all sorts of things.
This is breaking down barriers.
It is. And it's also creating new opportunities.
Like what?
Well, for example, there are all these new platforms that are connecting farmers with buyers. Which is helping them to get a better price for their products.
Okay, so technology can be a really powerful tool for development.
It can, but it's important to remember that it's just a tool.
Right, it's not a magic bullet.
No, it's not, and we need to be careful about how we use it.
Okay, so what are some of the potential downsides of technology?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is job displacement.
Right, because as technology gets more sophisticated, it's going to automate more and more jobs.
And that could lead to mass unemployment.
Which would obviously be a huge problem.
It would, and it's something that we need to be thinking about very carefully.
Okay, so job displacement is one concern. What else?
Well, another concern is the digital divide.
The digital divide.
Yeah, so not everyone has access to technology.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that some people are being left behind.
Right. It's like a new form of inequality.
It is, and it's something that we need to address.
Okay, so we need to make sure that everyone has access to technology.
We do, but even then, we need to be careful about how technology is being used.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, for example, there's a lot of concern about the way that social media is being used to spread misinformation and to manipulate people. And that can have a really negative impact on development.
Yeah, it can undermine trust.
Exactly. And it can also make it harder to build consensus.
Which is essential for development.
It is. So I think the key is to use technology in a way that's ethical and responsible.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, I think it starts with education.
Education.
Yeah, we need to teach people how to use technology critically and how to be aware of the potential risks.
So digital literacy is crucial.
It is. And we also need to have clear ethical guidelines for the development and use of technology.
So it's like a combination of individual responsibility and collective action.
Exactly. And I think that's true for development as a whole.
Right. It's not just about technology.
No, it's about everything we've been talking about today.
Context, specificity. People-centeredness.
Innovation.
Collaboration.
Honest.
All of these things are essential for creating a better future.
I agree. And I think we're at a really exciting moment in history because we have the opportunity to shape the future of development.
And to make it more just and sustainable.
Exactly. And I'm really optimistic about what we can achieve.
Me too. And I think the key is to keep having these conversations.
Absolutely. We need to keep talking to each other. And we need to keep learning from each other.
Because that's how we're going to make progress.
It is, yeah. And I think one really promising approach is participatory development.
Participatory development.
Yeah.
Okay, I like the sound of that. Tell me more.
So it's basically about flipping the script on traditional top-down development.
Okay.
You know, where experts come in and tell communities what they need.
Right.
Instead, it's about listening to the needs and aspirations of the people who are actually affected by development projects and giving them a real say in how those projects are designed and implemented.
So it's about empowering communities.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that local knowledge is essential.
And that people are more likely to support solutions that they've had a hand in creating.
Absolutely. Because when people feel like they're part of the process, they're more likely to take ownership of it.
And they're more likely to make it a success.
Exactly. And this isn't just some idealistic notion either.
Okay.
It's actually happening all over the world.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, there are countless examples of communities that have successfully implemented participatory development projects.
Okay, so it's not just like some feel-good idea.
No, it's a real thing.
And it's actually working.
It is, and I think it's one of the most promising approaches to development that we have.
Okay, so participatory development is one piece of the puzzle. What else do we need to be thinking about?
Well, I think another key ingredient is innovation.
Innovation.
Yeah, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with Iversen and Soskice.
Yeah.
You know how they argued that democratic systems tend to foster innovation?
Because they invest more in education and create more opportunities for social mobility.
Exactly, and I think that's really important because innovation is what's going to allow us to solve the complex challenges we face today.
Right, and those challenges are only going to get more complex in the future.
They are climate change, population growth, resource scarcity. These are all huge issues that are going to require us to be incredibly innovative.
Okay, so innovation is crucial, but how do we actually foster innovation?
Well, I think one important thing is to create an environment where people feel safe to take risks.
Okay.
You know, where they're not afraid to fail.
Right, because failure is part of the process.
It is. I mean, you're not going to come up with anything truly innovative if you're not willing to fail.
Okay, so we need to create a culture of experimentation.
Absolutely. And we also need to invest in education and research. Because those are the foundations of innovation.
Right, and it's not just about STEM fields either.
No, it's about all fields. Right. We need innovation in the arts, in the humanities, and the social sciences.
Because innovation is about more than just technology.
Exactly. It's about new ideas and new ways of thinking.
And that can come from anywhere.
It can.
Okay, so we've got participatory development, we've got innovation. Anything else?
Well, I think the last thing I want to touch on is the importance of hope.
Hope?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds kind of cheesy.
No, I get it.
But I think it's really important to believe that a better future is possible.
Right, because if we don't believe that, then we're not going to be very motivated to work for it.
Exactly. And I think there's reason to be hopeful.
Okay, why is that?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of positive trends in the world today.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, extreme poverty is declining. Life expectancy is increasing.
And more people are getting access to education and healthcare.
Exactly. So I think there's reason to believe that we're moving in the right direction.
Right. And I think that's a really important message to leave people with.
It is, because we need to be realistic about the challenges we face, but we also need to be optimistic about our ability to overcome them.
And I think that optimism is what's going to fuel the next generation of development practitioners.
I agree. And I think it's what's going to allow us to create a world that's more just and sustainable for everyone.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
But before we go, I just want to say thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in.
Yeah, we really appreciate your support.
It's been an incredible experience exploring these complex and challenging topics with you.
It has, and I've learned so much from our conversations.
Me too, and I hope you have too, listener.
Yeah, we hope this deep dive has given you some new insights into development.
And some new tools for thinking about the future.
And most importantly, we hope it's inspired you to get involved.
Because the future is not something that just happens to us.
It's something that we create together.
So let's get to work.
Let's do it.